16-year-old Ethan was humiliated for wearing his grandfather's tattered jacket until a general walked in and changed his life forever. Hit that like button and subscribe. Every new subscriber helps us share more stories that deserve to be heard. The early morning air bit Ethan Monroe's cheeks as he walked along the cracked sidewalk, his breath rising in soft clouds that vanished into the cold gray sky. Autumn leaves swirled at his feet, and his hands were buried deep in the pockets of the old military jacket that hung loosely on his narrow frame. The fabric was worn and faded, its once sharp olive green dulled by time. The sleeves stretched just a little too long for his arms, and the frayed cuffs brushed against his knuckles with each step. Cars passed by occasionally, but no one paid him much attention. That was fine with Ethan. He preferred it that way. At 16, he'd become an expert at slipping through life unnoticed. He kept his head down, his shoulders slightly hunched, the world passing him by like scenery on a train ride he hadn't chosen to take. The jacket was heavy on him, not just in weight, but in meaning. Above his left chest pocket, the name tag read H. Monroe. The letters faded but still visible if you looked closely. And on the right shoulder, barely hanging on, was the patch, a red and gold emblem shaped like a lightning bolt cutting through storm clouds. It was stitched unevenly, as if by hand, long ago. Ethan crossed the school parking lot and headed toward the entrance, hearing the familiar buzz of voices and laughter before even opening the doors. As he stepped inside, the warmth of the building hit him, but it did little to ease the chill inside his chest. The hallways were already crowded with students clustered in groups, chatting, laughing, sharing inside jokes. Ethan wove through them like a ghost, keeping his head down, eyes fixed on the floor, hoping no one would notice him. But they always did. "Hey, Ethan!" A voice rang out from behind him, sharp and mocking. He flinched instinctively, his shoulders tensing as he recognized the voice. "Caleb." Ethan kept walking, pretending not to hear, but the footsteps quickened behind him. "Hey, man, nice jacket," Caleb sneered, catching up. "Is that like a thrift store find? Or did you crawl out of a war movie set?" Mason, Caleb's constant shadow, snickered beside him. "Looks like Grandpa cosplayed me," Mason added, giving a fake salute. Caleb burst out laughing. "Yeah, seriously, dude. You try and start a new fashion trend? Vintage battlefield chic." The laughter echoed in Ethan's ears, but he kept moving, his face carefully blank. He had learned long ago that reacting only made it worse. If he stayed quiet, they'd eventually get bored. "Whatever, man," Caleb muttered when Ethan didn't respond. "You're no fun." The two of them drifted away, still chuckling to themselves, leaving Ethan alone again. He made his way to his locker, avoiding eye contact with anyone nearby. The rest of the morning passed in much the same way, slipping into his classes, sitting in the back, taking notes quietly, and leaving as soon as the bell rang. He ate his lunch alone at the far end of the cafeteria, his tray sitting untouched for most of the period as he picked at his food. The loud chatter of other students filled the room, but to Ethan, it was just background noise. Every so often, he caught glimpses of groups laughing together, friends sharing videos, athletes tossing a football around near the lunch tables. All things he wasn't part of. As lunch wound down, he pulled his phone out and scrolled aimlessly, not really reading anything. His fingers traced the edge of the patch on his jacket absent-mindedly. The fabric was rough beneath his fingertips, the stitching slightly raised. It was familiar, comforting in its own strange way. The final bell eventually rang, and Ethan made his way home, walking the same quiet route in reverse. The sky had darkened, and the chill had deepened. By the time he reached his house, a small, modest home tucked on a quiet residential street, his fingertips were numb. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him softly. The smell of something warm cooking in the kitchen greeted him, and for the first time all day, a small sliver of comfort touched him. "Hey, honey," his mother, Laura Monroe, called from the stove. She glanced over her shoulder and offered a warm smile. "How was your day?" Ethan shrugged, slipping off his shoes and hanging his backpack by the door. "Same as always." Laura turned off the burner and walked over, pulling him into a gentle hug. "Well, I'm glad you're home." Ethan allowed himself to relax for a moment in her embrace. She was small but strong, Her hair pulled back into a loose ponytail, eyes filled with warmth and quiet resilience. She worked hard, 2 jobs most weeks, but always made sure to be home when he arrived. As they sat down for dinner, Laura glanced at the jacket he still wore. "You wore Grandpa's jacket again today," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "Yeah. You know you don't have to, right? Not if it makes things harder at school." He looked down at his plate. "I know, but it feels like I'm carrying a piece of him with me." Laura smiled gently. "He would have liked that. Your grandfather was a brave man, Ethan. He went through a lot wearing that jacket." Ethan's eyes drifted to the patch again. "You never really talk about his time in the war." Laura sighed, her expression turning distant for a moment. It wasn't easy for him to talk about, but he was proud of his service. And we were proud of him. That patch, it meant something very few people could understand. There was a brief pause as they sat quietly. "You're strong, Ethan," she added. "Stronger than you think." Just like he was. Ethan managed a small smile, the first genuine one that day. "Thanks, Mom." They finished dinner together, the quiet comfort of home wrapping around them like a soft blanket against the world outside. As the evening wore on, Ethan sat at his desk, the jacket draped over the back of his chair. His fingers traced the edges of the patch again, his mind swirling with questions he never quite dared ask. He stared out the window into the night, the faint hum of cars passing by in the distance, wondering, not for the first time, what stories were stitched into those faded threads. The next evening, Ethan sat alone in his room, the jacket draped carefully across his lap. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, rattling the loose branches against the window pane. A soft glow from his desk lamp illuminated the worn fabric, casting long shadows across the stitching as his fingers traced the faded name tag one more time. His mind wandered, pulling him into the stories he had only heard in fragments. He closed his eyes, and in the quiet of his room, the world shifted. The hum of cicadas filled the air. Dense jungle leaves rustled under heavy boots. Rain poured in a steady sheet, soaking through uniforms, running down the faces of young soldiers as they moved silently through the thick Vietnam undergrowth. The air was heavy with humidity and tension, every breath thick, every movement cautious. In the middle of the column of soldiers marched a young man, Henry Monroe, Ethan's grandfather. His face was youthful, but hardened by weeks in the field. His eyes stayed sharp beneath his helmet, scanning the dense jungle around him. The jacket, newer then, hugged his strong frame, its green still vibrant, the red and gold patch bright against his shoulder like a beacon. Explosions cracked in the distance. Orders were whispered, hand signals exchanged. The group shifted positions, melting into the brush as they advanced. Every move was precise, every sound deliberate. Henry raised a fist, signaling the squad to halt as they crouched low. The tension was palpable, but there was a quiet confidence in Henry's eyes, a calm in the chaos. Ethan watched it all unfold in his mind, like an old film reel. No words were spoken, but the weight of the scene was heavy. The rain, the jungle, the danger. It was a world he could barely comprehend. The flashback dissolved like mist as the sound of a knock on his door pulled him back to present. "Come in," Ethan called softly. Laura entered carrying 2 mugs of tea, her smile warm but knowing. She set one down on his desk before pulling up a chair beside him. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked gently. Ethan shook his head. "Just thinking." Her eyes fell to the jacket, draped over his lap. She reached out and brushed her fingers across the frayed sleeve, her touch gentle. "He wore it everywhere," she said softly, "even after he came home." Ethan's fingers found the patch again, tracing the rough outline of the lightning bolt. "You never really told me much about what he did," he said quietly, not as an accusation, but as an invitation. Laura sighed, her gaze growing distant, as if looking through the walls into another time. "Your grandfather was a brave man, Ethan, but the things he saw over there, they weren't easy to talk about." She paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "He was part of a special reconnaissance unit. Very few made it through the kind of missions they were assigned. They'd be sent deep into enemy territory, sometimes for days at a time, gathering information, guiding strikes, rescuing captured soldiers. Extremely dangerous work. Her voice trembled slightly, but she steadied it. "That patch," she said, nodding to the emblem under Ethan's fingers, "belonged to his unit. Recon Lightning, they called themselves. Not many soldiers wore that patch. It was given to only a few." Ethan swallowed, staring at the fabric as if seeing it for the first time. The colors may have faded, but now the weight behind them felt heavier, more significant. "He never bragged about it," Laura continued. "When he came home, he wanted peace, family. He focused on building a life here with us. But I knew there were nights when the memories came back. He'd sit by the window for hours, just staring into the dark." Ethan looked up at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Was he scared?" Laura smiled faintly. "He was human, Ethan. Of course he was scared. But he didn't let fear control him. That's what made him brave. He faced things most people couldn't imagine, and still found the strength to come back, to build a life, to raise a family." Silence settled between them for a few moments as Ethan absorbed her words. The jacket in his lap suddenly felt heavier, as though it carried not just fabric and thread, but the very weight of history, of sacrifice. "I don't feel like I deserve to wear it," Ethan admitted quietly. "I mean, I haven't done anything. I'm not brave like he was." Laura reached over and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Ethan, wearing that jacket doesn't mean you're trying to be him. It's a way of honoring him. You carry his name, his memory. You're not pretending to be a hero. You're reminding the world that one existed." "But the kids at school," Ethan began, his voice cracking. "They don't understand. They just see something old and weird. They make fun of me." Laura's expression softened even more, her voice steady. "People often mock what they don't understand. But that doesn't change the truth, does it? Your grandfather was a hero. That jacket is part of the story. And by wearing it, you're keeping that story alive." Ethan nodded slowly, staring at the patch once more. The lightning bolt, though faded, seemed to glow faintly under the lamplight. "You can choose to be proud of who you are, Ethan," Laura said gently. "No one else gets to decide your worth." He looked at her, searching her face for doubt, but found none. Only warmth. Only truth. "Thanks, Mom," he whispered. She smiled and patted his hand before standing up. "Get some rest, sweetheart. Tomorrow's a new day." Ethan watched her leave, the door closing softly behind her. The room settled into silence again, broken only by the softening of the wind outside. He picked up the jacket, feeling its weight in his hands. Slowly, he slipped it back on, the fabric cool against the skin. The sleeves hung long, the shoulders a bit wide, but somehow it felt right, like it belonged there. As he sat at his desk, staring out into the night, the stars glimmered faintly above the dark silhouette of the trees. The wind whispered softly, and for a brief moment, Ethan imagined he could hear the distant echo of his grandfather's steady voice, calm and resolute, carried gently through the night air. The days grew colder as autumn deepened, but Ethan still walked to school each morning in his grandfather's jacket. Each step toward the building felt heavier now, the eyes of his classmates burning into him before he even crossed the threshold. The teasing hadn't stopped. If anything, it had gotten worse. By lunchtime, the cafeteria was alive with noise, students laughing, chatting, and scrolling through their phones. Ethan sat in his usual corner, tray untouched, eyes lowered. The jacket's fabric was a familiar weight across his shoulders, but today it felt different. Exposed, vulnerable. From the far side of the room, Caleb and Mason spotted him. Their voices cut through the chatter like knives. "Hey, look who's here," Caleb said loudly, nudging Mason. Mr. Battlefield fashioned himself. Mason grinned as they approached. "You know, Ethan, I've been thinking. That jacket's got some serious vintage vibes. You could probably sell it to a museum." Laughter erupted from the surrounding tables. Caleb leaned in closer, smirking. "Or maybe a thrift store. Probably where you got it anyway." Ethan kept his eyes on his tray, his face burning. He tried to steady his breathing, focusing on the small movement of his fork as he pushed food around. But today, Mason wasn't content with just words. Without Ethan noticing, Mason had pulled out his phone and started recording. He zoomed in on the frayed cuffs, the faded patch, the name tag barely hanging on. All while Caleb's taunts continued in the background. Seriously, man. Hobo chic is a bold choice, Caleb laughed. Is that mothballs I smell, or is that just part of the aesthetic? More laughter. A few students nearby snickered, their eyes darting between Ethan and the phone camera. Across the table, Brianna sat quietly. She was always there with the others, but unlike Caleb and Mason, her smile never quite reached her eyes. Today, she shifted uncomfortably, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her water bottle. She glanced at Mason's phone briefly, but said nothing. Later that afternoon, as Ethan walked home, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A sick feeling settled in his stomach before he even pulled it out. His fingers trembled as he unlocked the screen. There it was, the video Mason had recorded, uploaded publicly. Dozens of comments were already pouring in. Hobo much? Did his grandpa get that from a yard sale? Somebody get this kid a new jacket before it falls apart. Ethan's chest tightened as the words blurred before his eyes. The cruel laughter he'd faced at school now echoed online, amplified, immortalized. By the time he reached home, the weight of the day had fully settled on him. He slipped inside quietly, closing the door behind him as if trying to keep the outside world at bay. The house was warm, but offered little comfort tonight. Laura was in the living room folding laundry when she looked up and saw his face. "Rough day?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded, unable to form words. She set the laundry aside and walked over, pulling him into a gentle hug. He didn't resist. "Want to talk about it?" she whispered. For a long moment, he was silent. Then, finally, his voice broke through, strained and hollow. "They filmed me, Mom. They posted it online." Laura closed her eyes briefly, pulling him closer. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart." He pulled back, his voice cracking. "Maybe I should just stop wearing it. Maybe it's not worth it." Laura studied his face, seeing not just the pain but the quiet shame lurking beneath it. She reached out, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "Ethan," she said softly, "come with me. There's something I want to show you." She led him to the den, where an old cedar chest sat tucked beneath the window. Ethan had seen it before, but never paid much attention. Laura knelt down and carefully opened the lid, revealing neatly organized keepsakes inside, old photographs, medals, and yellow documents. She pulled out a fragile newspaper clipping, the edges brittle with age. The headline was bold, "Recon Lightning, the 6 who survived." Ethan's eyes widened as he carefully took the clipping from her hands. "That's your grandfather's unit," Laura explained softly. "During one of their most dangerous missions, only 6 men made it back. Your grandfather was one of them." Ethan stared at the grainy black and white photo. A small group of young men stood shoulder to shoulder in front of a battered military vehicle. Their faces were hard, eyes focused, yet something in their expression spoke of relief and exhaustion. Henry Monroe stood among them, the same jacket on his back, its patch crisp and bright in the photo. He never wanted attention for it. Laura continued, "But that doesn't make what he did any less extraordinary." Ethan ran his fingers gently over his grandfather's face in the photo, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know it was that bad." "It was," Laura said softly. "But even after everything he went through, he came home and built a life. He carried the weight of what happened, but he didn't let it define him." Ethan swallowed hard. "I feel like I don't deserve to wear this. Like I'm pretending." Laura's voice was steady. "You're not pretending, Ethan. You're remembering. You're honoring him. And you're stronger than you think for doing that." Later that night, long after Laura had gone to bed, Ethan sat at his desk with a newspaper clipping in front of him. The room was silent except for the soft tapping of keys as he opened his laptop and began typing. "Recon Lightning Unit. Vietnam War." Dozens of search results appeared, and he clicked through them carefully, reading every detail he could find. Articles mentioned covert missions, deep enemy territory, and possible odds. The unit's specialty was reconnaissance and extraction, often sent into situations where survival was unlikely. He found fragments of declassified reports, accounts from other veterans, and even scanned photos of patches identical to the one on his jacket. Each piece painted a clearer picture of what his grandfather had endured. The more he read, the more Ethan felt a strange mixture of awe and heaviness settle over him. His grandfather had faced horrors beyond his comprehension, yet still found the strength to come home and raise a family. As the clock ticked past midnight, Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the patch once more. The faded threads glimmered faintly under the lamplight, their story far from worn out. He wasn't sure yet what tomorrow would bring. But tonight, for the first time, the jacket didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a link. The morning sun broke through thin clouds as Principal Donovan strode briskly to the halls of Crestwood High. His polished dress shoes clacked against the newly waxed floors. His phone pressed firmly against his ear. Yes, everything is on schedule, he said, his voice slightly breathless. Security has been briefed. The students are prepped, and we've reserved the front parking lot for her motorcade. He paused as he neared the main office, lowering his voice. Of course I understand the significance of this visit, sir. We're honored, absolutely honored. He ended the call with a proud smile and took a moment to straighten his tie in the glass trophy case's reflection. Behind him, colorful posters lined the hallway walls, announcing the Veterans Day Assembly in bold, cheerful letters. But even the brightly colored flyers couldn't fully capture the excitement buzzing through the school. General Alexandra Briggs was coming. Word spread like wildfire through the student body. A 4-star general, one of only a handful in the country, would be standing on the very stage where awkward school plays and talent shows were usually performed. To most of the students, it was a distant, almost unreal event, but to the staff, it was monumental. Down at Fort Hamilton Army Base, several miles away, General Briggs sat in a small conference room, reviewing the day's itinerary. Sunlight filtered through the slats of the window blinds, casting stripes of light across the polished table. She looked up from the schedule and rubbed her temples for a moment before glancing at her aide, Captain Morales. High school assemblies, she said with a quiet sigh. Not exactly standard duty. Captain Morales smiled faintly, though he knew better than to respond too casually. They're very excited for your visit, ma'am. The principal's been personally overseeing the preparations. Briggs exhaled and sat back in her chair, her uniform impeccably pressed, every ribbon and medal perfectly aligned. The weight of her rank sat heavily on her shoulders, but she carried it with the ease of long habit. It's not the speaking that bothers me, she said after a moment. It's everything else. She didn't elaborate, but her gaze drifted toward the folder in front of her, a briefing packet prepared by her staff. It contained photos of the school, the speaking schedule, student bios, and the list of honored guests. Her fingers hovered briefly over one name, Henry Monroe. Her expression softened almost imperceptibly. Morales noticed, but kept his voice neutral. You don't usually accept these kinds of requests, ma'am. May I ask why this one? Briggs didn't answer right away. She flipped the folder closed, resting both hands atop it. Her eyes stayed distant, as though replaying memories that were not meant for sharing. Sometimes, she said quietly, it's important to remind people where they come from, and who made it possible for them to be here. Morales nodded respectfully, sensing that was as much as she intended to say. The general's convoy was scheduled to arrive at the school the next morning. Security had been coordinated with local law enforcement, and the school administration had been briefed thoroughly. Every detail had been reviewed down to the seating arrangements. Back at Crestwood High, Principal Donovan stood in the auditorium alongside Mrs. Jenkins, the school's event coordinator, who was furiously scribbling notes on her clipboard. The flags have been set up, Mr. Donovan, she reported briskly. The student choir is rehearsing at 1 p.m. The media crew is handling the live stream. All VIP seating has been marked. Donovan clasped his hands together, nodding approvingly. Excellent. Excellent work, Marjorie. He glanced toward the freshly polished stage where the Veterans Day banner hung neatly above the podium. The school's honor students had already arranged the American flag, the state flag, and the POWMIA banner with meticulous care. It's not every day we host someone like General Briggs, Donovan said, his voice filled with pride. The students need to understand the magnitude of this moment. Mrs. Jenkins smiled, though she barely looked up from her clipboard. They will, sir. As they spoke, students passed by in the hallway outside, buzzing with curiosity. Rumors swirled as they tried to piece together who General Briggs was and why she was visiting their school. "I heard she fought in Iraq," one student whispered to another. "No, Afghanistan. My dad said she's the first female general to command a unit," came another voice. "I heard she's met the president like 5 times. She's got more medals than anyone." The stories varied wildly, but all carried the same wide-eyed awe. Among the sea of chattering students, Ethan Monroe walked quietly with his head down. Though the school hummed with energy over the assembly, his mind remained distant. The weight of recent days still lingered. Mason's video, the endless online comments, the quiet sting of humiliation. Even now, as he passed clusters of students whispering and laughing, he couldn't shake the feeling that every glance in his direction carried hidden mockery. The jacket clung to him like a second skin. Familiar, heavy, meaningful, yet painfully conspicuous. He overheard Mason's voice behind him as he crossed the quad. "Bet you anything she'll take one look at that rag he wears and think it's a joke." Caleb snorted. "Yeah, he's gonna embarrass himself big time." Ethan kept walking, gripping the strap of his backpack tighter, forcing himself not to react. But Brianna, walking just a few steps behind them, glanced at Ethan with a flicker of discomfort in her eyes. She hesitated, but said nothing, falling silent as the boys laughed on. The next morning promised to be unlike any other. As dawn approached, the halls of Crestwood High would soon fill with students in neatly pressed outfits, teachers reviewing scripts, and security officers checking every corner. Flags would wave, cameras would roll, and the students would sit shoulder to shoulder in the gymnasium awaiting their guest of honor. But somewhere behind the pomp and ceremony, behind the honor guard and the banners, a deeper story remained quietly poised, one that had yet to reveal itself. For now, though, the school simply held its breath, waiting for the arrival of General Alexandra Briggs. The sky outside Ethan's bedroom window was already dark, but inside the soft glow of his desk lamp illuminated the scattered papers and open tabs on his laptop. His fingers moved carefully over the keys, eyes scanning every word on the screen, as if they might reveal a hidden piece of his grandfather's world. He leaned closer, reading one particular forum post for the 3rd time. The website wasn't official, just a place where veterans and military enthusiasts shared stories, memories, and research about different units. But this post stood out. Recon Lightning was tasked with high-risk recon during DAC 2, near-suicidal missions. Only a handful made it back. One of them was Sergeant Henry Monroe. His bravery saved several men that day. True hero. Ethan's pulse quickened, seeing his grandfather's name in black and white, mentioned by strangers who clearly held deep respect, made everything feel suddenly more real. These weren't just family stories told by his mother late at night. This was confirmation, validation. He had read about DACTA before, a brutal series of battles in Vietnam, notorious for their intensity and high casualties. But this post hinted at something even more dangerous. Recon Lightning had been sent ahead of the main forces, gathering intelligence deep in enemy territory. They had faced near impossible odds. He whispered the words under his breath. Near suicidal mission. The words sounded heavy, far removed from anything Ethan had ever known in his quiet suburban life. His grandfather had volunteered for that, survived that. As he scrolled further, a grainy black and white photo loaded onto the page. The caption simply read, Recon Lightning Survivors, Post-Act 2. There he was again, Henry Monroe, younger than Ethan had ever imagined him, standing among a small group of soldiers. The jacket was unmistakable, the patch still vivid back then, resting high on his grandfather's shoulder like a badge of honor. Ethan instinctively glanced at the jacket draped over the back of his chair. The patch was more faded now, but still there, red and gold, its stitching worn but proud. The insignia, Recon Lightning. He reached out, running his fingers over the threads. The fabric was rough and tired, but it carried a weight far heavier than his physical form. His anxiety buzzed beneath his skin, but for the first time, it mixed with something new, a flicker of pride. Grandpa, you were incredible, he whispered to the empty room. Yet, as his chest swelled with newfound respect. A tight knot of worry still twisted in his stomach. The video Mason had posted was still circulating. Comments kept appearing, some cruel, some mocking, others piling on like sharks sensing blood. And with the assembly approaching, Ethan couldn't help but fear what Mason and Caleb might do next. The following morning at school, whispers spread like wildfire about the upcoming assembly. "Tomorrow's the big day." Mason grinned as he slung his arm around Caleb's shoulders, walking down the main hallway. "General Briggs is going to be front and center, all eyes on her." Caleb snorted. "And all eyes on Monroe when we hit him with round 2. They exchanged a glance, their smiles widening like coiled snakes ready to strike. "I've got the clip ready," Mason said, lowering his voice. "This time we stream it live." His little meltdown front and center, everyone watching, even the general. Caleb laughed, enjoying the thought. "We'll make sure that jacket finally gets the attention it deserves." A few feet behind them, Brianna walked silently, her books pressed tightly against her chest. She heard every word but kept her eyes forward, chewing her lip. The growing unease she felt around Mason and Caleb was impossible to ignore now, but fear of speaking out anchored her feet to the floor. At lunch, Ethan sat in his usual corner, head down, barely tasting his food. The jacket clung to his thin frame like a shield, though lately it felt like a target. Students passed by, many of them sneaking glances or murmuring under their breath, feeding the endless cycle. Every so often, Ethan's hand drifted to the patch again. Each time his fingertips traced its edges, he imagined his grandfather standing where he had once stood, young, terrified, but brave beyond words. The thought offered some comfort, but couldn't completely block out the anxiety bubbling inside him. Later that evening, as he sat at the dinner table with his mother, the tension in his shoulders finally broke. "They're planning something at the assembly," Ethan said softly, his fork barely touching his plate. "Mason and Caleb. I can feel it." Laura looked up from her meal, concern flashing across her face. "What kind of something?" "I don't know exactly, but I know they want to humiliate me again, in front of everyone." Laura reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I know how hard this has been." Ethan swallowed hard, his voice small. "Sometimes I wonder if I should have just left the jacket at home. Maybe none of this would have happened." Laura's eyes softened. "Ethan, your grandfather wore that jacket into battle, through jungles and storms, through fear and danger. He never took it off, even when it would have been easier to give up. You're carrying his legacy, not their mockery." Tears threatened at the corners of Ethan's eyes, but he blinked them away. He wanted to believe her. He did, but the pit in his stomach refused to ease. "Tomorrow's the assembly," he whispered. "And I don't know if I'm ready." Laura squeezed his hand gently. "Whatever happens, know this. Your grandfather will be proud of you, and so am I." For a moment, Ethan sat there in silence, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the room. Then, almost without thinking, his eyes drifted back to the newspaper clipping Laura had shown him days before. The photo of the 6 surviving men stared back at him. Only 6 survived. The words echoed in his head. He tried to imagine what his grandfather would say now, if he were sitting across the table, sipping coffee and smiling through old war stories. "Stand tall, kid. You're stronger than you know." Ethan closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The weight remained, but the spark of pride flickered brighter. The assembly was coming, and with it, whatever Mason and Caleb had planned. But so was something else, something he didn't yet fully understand. The gymnasium at Crestwood High pulsed with energy. Early morning sunlight filtered to the high windows, casting long beams onto the polished wooden floor. Folding chairs lined the gym in precise rows, occupied by students, parents, and honored guests. The American flag stood tall on the stage, flanked by banners of red, white, and blue. The Veterans Day assembly was underway. Ethan stood near the back of the gym, trying to steady his breathing. His fingers lightly traced the familiar threads of his grandfather's jacket, the worn fabric like a second skin against his nerves. He had debated wearing it all night, tossing and turning in bed, But when morning came, he slipped it on with quiet determination. Now, standing under bright lights and surrounded by hundreds of eyes, the jacket felt heavier than ever. Veterans from the local community filled the first 2 rows. Men and women of various ages. Some in uniform, others wearing their service pins proudly on their lapels. They exchanged handshakes and quiet nods, their faces reflecting stories that needed no words. At the podium, Principal Donovan beamed, gripping the microphone with both hands. His voice rang out, amplified by the gym speaker system. Ladies and gentlemen, students, faculty, and honored guests, welcome to Crestwood High School's annual Veterans Day Assembly. Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Camera flashes blinked sporadically as local press and proud parents snapped photos. The school choir stood along the bleachers, their matching outfits crisp, voices ready. Ethan shifted his weight, glancing nervously toward the other side of the gym. There they were, Mason and Caleb, sitting with their phones in hand, smirking like 2 predators waiting for their moment. Caleb nudged Mason, whispering something that made them both chuckle under their breath. Ethan's stomach twisted. He tried not to look at them, focusing instead on Principal Donovan's voice echoing off the gym walls. Today, we gather not only to honor those who have served, but to reflect on the sacrifices that make our freedoms possible. We are privileged this morning to host members of our local veteran community, and we thank each and every one of you for your service. The crowd applauded again, louder this time. A few students rose to their feet to clap more enthusiastically. The veterans in the front row nodded humbly, some offering faint smiles. Ethan's gaze fell on the stage, where 2 uniformed cadets slowly raised the American flag. The choir director signaled her group, and they broke into a clear, powerful rendition of the national anthem. The choir's harmony filled the gym, voices blending in perfect unity. Even Mason and Caleb fell briefly silent, though the mischief never left their eyes. As the anthem ended, Principal Donovan returned to the microphone, his voice now even more animated. Before we continue, I'd like to recognize each veteran in attendance today. As I call your name, please stand. One by one, names were read aloud. Each met with applause. Ethan watched as elderly men and women rose from their seats, some using canes, others standing tall with practiced military posture. Lieutenant James Parker, Sergeant Diane Cole, Captain Arthur Reynolds. The roll call continued, each name reminding Ethan of how small he felt among these giants of history. Yet under the weight of his nerves, the jacket seemed to pulse with quiet strength, as though his grandfather's hand rested on his shoulder. Then, as Donovan finished reading the names, he paused for a brief moment of silence, allowing the weight of the occasion to settle into the room. The silence stretched. Ethan's heartbeat echoed in his ears. He caught sight of Brianna, sitting several rows ahead, her eyes darting between him and the bullies. She wore an expression he couldn't quite read, something between concern and guilt, but she didn't say a word. Thank you all for your sacrifice, Donovan finally continued, his voice softening. Now, we come to the highlight of today's assembly, a visit from one of our nation's highest-ranking officers. In just a few moments, we will welcome General Alexandra Briggs to address us. The audience murmured with excitement. Students shifted in their seats, teachers straightened their jackets, and a few reporters leaned forward, cameras poised. The weight of General Briggs' reputation had already set the school abuzz for days. Now, the moment was drawing near. Ethan's palms were slick with sweat. The jacket felt warm under the bright gym lights. His mind raced, trapped between pride and dread. He could still feel Mason and Caleb's eyes boring into his back. They're waiting for me to fall apart, he thought. They want to catch it on camera. Mason raised his phone slightly, pretending to adjust the angle as though preparing for a moment that hadn't arrived yet. Caleb snickered beside him. Ethan clenched his jaw. His fingers found the edge of the Recon Lightning patch once more. The threads were loose, but they held fast, just like Grandpa Henry. He closed his eyes briefly, trying to summon the courage to stand his ground. His grandfather had faced far worse than snickering teenagers with smartphones. The gym doors opened at the far end. A uniformed officer stepped through, followed closely by several aides. A hush fell over the crowd as every head turned in unison. The moment had arrived. General Alexandra Briggs walked with steady, purposeful strides, her crisp uniform gleaming beneath the gymnasium lights. Her rows of medals reflected the stage's spotlights as her polished black shoes echoed off the hardwood floor. Students whispered in awe. Parents leaned forward to catch a better look. Principal Donovan's face lit up as he stepped forward, extending his hand with exaggerated enthusiasm. "General Briggs, we are truly honored to have you with us today." The general offered a brief, polite nod, her eyes briefly scanning the room before returning to Donovan. "The honor is mine," she replied, her voice calm but authoritative. As she was led toward the stage, Ethan's breath caught for a moment, though she hadn't looked directly at him yet. Her presence filled the gym like a force of nature. The choir prepared for one final performance as the assembly reached its most anticipated moment. But for Ethan, standing there under the weight of hundreds of eyes and a heavy jacket on his back, the pressure had never been greater. And somewhere in the crowd, Mason's finger hovered above his phone screen, ready for whatever would come next. The gymnasium held its collective breath. General Alexandra Briggs stood at the podium, tall and composed, her uniform pristine beneath the harsh gymnasium lights. The rows of medals on her chest shimmered faintly as she rested both hands on the podium, exuding an air of command that demanded attention without uttering a word. Her sharp eyes scanned the sea of faces before her. Students, faculty, veterans, parents, all seated in neat rows. The weight of her presence seemed to press against the walls themselves. This wasn't just another guest speaker. This was a leader shaped by years of battle and sacrifice. Ethan could feel her gaze moving across the crowd like a spotlight, each second stretching longer than the last. His throat tightened as she continued scanning. The jacket on his shoulders felt heavier now, like every thread carried generations of weight. And then it happened. Her eyes landed on him. The shift was almost imperceptible, but Ethan felt it instantly, a subtle narrowing of her gaze, the brief pause in her survey of the crowd. Her lips parted slightly as a surprise, but quickly pressed into a firm, unreadable line. Mason, seated just a few rows to Ethan's right, nudged Caleb hard in the ribs. "Look at her face." Mason whispered, barely able to contain his glee. "She's staring at him." Caleb snorted under his breath. "Oh man, this is going to be better than I thought." They both glanced at their phones, ready to record whatever happened next. General Briggs stood motionless for a heartbeat longer. The murmurs in the audience were soft but growing. People noticed where her attention had shifted. Principal Donovan glanced nervously between the general and the audience, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. Then, without warning, she stepped away from the podium. Her boots echoed sharply against the polished gym floor, cutting through the whispers like a blade. The entire gym hushed in sync, as if some invisible force had silenced every voice. All eyes followed her deliberate steps as she descended from the stage and began walking directly into the rows of students. Students instinctively leaned back, clearing a path. Teachers straightened up, exchanging confused glances. The veterans in the front row watched quietly, recognizing something familiar in her movements, a soldier's decisiveness. Ethan's heartbeat pounded louder with each step she took. His palms grew clammy as she drew closer. He wanted to shrink, to vanish on the floorboards, but his feet remained frozen. Mason's camera phone was already recording, his thumb steady on the screen. "Oh, this is gold," he whispered gleefully. The general didn't waver, her sharp gaze never breaking from Ethan as she moved through the rows. The sound of her footsteps became the only rhythm in the vast space, echoing with authority. Finally, she stopped, directly in front of Ethan. The room held its breath once more, as if even the walls themselves were waiting. Ethan looked up slowly, his eyes wide, meeting hers for the first time. The way of her stare wasn't cruel or angry, but intense, searching, as though she were reading every thread of his soul. Her voice, when it came, was low but firm. It carried across the entire gym with ease, as if amplified by something stronger than any microphone. "Where'd you get that jacket?" The question cut through the air, both simple and impossible at once. The crowd shifted. Whispers erupted again like ripples in a pond. Students exchanged wide-eyed glances. Teachers sat frozen, unsure what this sudden confrontation meant. Mason's grin stretched wider, his phone locked onto Ethan's face. eager to capture the boy's humiliation. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. His legs felt unsteady, but somehow he stayed on his feet. The pressure of hundreds of eyes pressing against him made the room feel smaller, tighter. He opened his mouth, but the words caught for a moment. His voice was small when it finally emerged. "It belonged to my grandfather," he managed, barely above a whisper. "Sergeant Henry Monroe." General Briggs blinked slowly, her intense gaze never leaving him. The name seemed to land heavily in the air between them. The silence following his answer was almost deafening. Mason's camera trembled slightly in his hand as the tone of the moment shifted. Unexpectedly, the general's face changed subtly. Her jaw relaxed, her eyes softened, but the power behind her stare never diminished. She glanced briefly at the faded patch on Ethan's shoulder, the red and gold insignia nearly threadbare, but unmistakable. The entire gym seemed to hold its collective breath again, waiting for what would come next. In the audience, Brianna sat frozen, her heart racing. She glanced nervously between Ethan and the bullies, sensing that whatever was happening wasn't what anyone had expected. For Ethan, time had slowed to a crawl. He could feel every heartbeat, every drop of sweat on his brow, as the towering general stood before him, unmoving. The jacket, the very thing that had drawn ridicule for weeks, was now the center of something far larger than he could understand. And standing before him was someone who clearly recognized it. General Briggs inhaled softly, but said nothing more for now. The entire gym remained locked in the moment, suspended like a fragile thread waiting to snap. Principal Donovan, still standing helplessly at the podium, cleared his throat nervously, but chose not to interrupt the scene unfolding before him. The gravity of the moment was undeniable. Even Mason's grin was starting to falter, his phone still recording, but his expression now confused. This wasn't following the script he had imagined. The general's eyes lingered a moment longer on the patch, and then returned to Ethan's face. The faintest flicker of something unspoken crossed her features, recognition perhaps, or memory. And then, with her voice steady but quieter, as if addressing only him, she repeated softly, "Sergeant Henry Monroe." Ethan gave a small nod, his breath shaky. "Yes, ma'am." The weight of those words settled over the crowd like a dense fog. Without another word, General Briggs slowly straightened her shoulders, as if carefully considering what to say next. But for now, the confrontation remained suspended, leaving the entire gym captivated and silent. The silence was so profound that even the faint hum of the gym's fluorescent lights seemed deafening. Ethan's voice, though shaky, had carried across the vast room. "It belonged to my grandfather, Staff Sergeant Henry Monroe." The moment the name left his lips, something shifted in General Briggs's face. The hard lines around her eyes softened, the sharpness in her gaze melting into something far more personal, something almost tender. For a long moment, she simply stared at Ethan, as though seeing a ghost from decades ago standing before her. Her shoulders, still square with military precision, lowered just slightly as a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding escaped her. "I never thought I'd hear that name again," she said, her voice quieter but no less steady. "Henry Monroe." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder now. Students exchanged bewildered glances. Teachers leaned forward. Veterans in the front rows sat up straighter, as if suddenly pulled into memories of their own. Mason and Caleb, who had been poised with their phones ready for Ethan's humiliation, sat frozen. Mason's phone lowered slightly, his smug grin replaced by confusion. Brianna pressed a hand over her mouth, wide-eyed, sensing something much bigger was unfolding. General Briggs took a single step closer to Ethan, her voice stronger now, resonating with the entire gym. "Your grandfather saved my life." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The audience gasped audibly. Even Principal Donovan looked stunned, his mouth falling open behind the podium. Ethan blinked, struggling to comprehend. He did. General Briggs nodded, her voice carrying a gravity shaped by decades of memory. "It was Vietnam. 1967, the Battle of Dak To." The veterans in attendance stiffened slightly at the mention of the name, a battle long etched into the history books for its brutality and cost. "I was a young private," she continued, "fresh out of training. Naive. Scared. assigned to the Recon Lightning unit. Her eyes briefly flicked to the faded patch on Ethan's shoulder, as if it still held power even after all these years. We were sent on missions most wouldn't take, behind enemy lines, deep into dangerous territory. Your grandfather, she paused, her voice thickening, was already a leader even then. Brave, steady, the kind of man soldiers naturally followed. The room was spellbound. Every student, every parent, every veteran sat in rapt attention. One night, she continued, our convoy was ambushed. Explosives disabled our vehicles. I was trapped in one that caught fire. Chaos everywhere, gunfire, screaming, smoke so thick you couldn't breathe. Her eyes glazed slightly as if she were reliving it. I thought I was finished. The heat was unbearable. And then, through the flames, he appeared. General Briggs's voice trembled faintly, but her stance remained proud. Staff Sergeant Monroe pulled me from the burning wreckage, while bullets tore through the air around us, while others hesitated. He came back for me. He carried me on his shoulders through enemy fire, and didn't stop until he knew I was safe. A ripple of gas swept through the gym. Ethan's chest tightened. His grandfather's stories had always been few, guarded. Now, hearing them from someone who had lived it brought an entirely new depth to the man he had idolized but never truly known. He could have been evacuated then. General Briggs continued. He refused. He stayed behind to get the rest of the wounded out, risking his life again and again until every man and woman was accounted for. The gym fell completely silent. Not even Mason or Caleb dared whisper now. Their mocking had evaporated, replaced by awe. General Briggs's gaze never wavered from Ethan as she spoke, her voice both reverent and unwavering. Only 6 of us survived that mission. 6. And your grandfather was one of the reasons why. She glanced once more at the patch, the faded threads that had once been the subject of cruel jokes, now radiating unspeakable meaning. That patch you wear, son, Recon Lightning, was not handed out freely. It was earned by soldiers who volunteered for the most dangerous assignments of the war, men and women who faced odds most wouldn't dream of. She turned slightly to address the entire gym, her voice rising with authority. There are very few Recon Lightning patches left in this world. Few are still worn by the families of the heroes who earned them. What you see on this young man's shoulder is not a fashion statement. Her tone sharpened slightly. It is not something to mock or ridicule. It is a symbol of courage, of sacrifice, of valor. Gasps filled the room once again. Whispers rippled among the students. Even the teachers exchanged stunned looks, the weight of the revelation sinking into everyone present. Brianna blinked rapidly, swallowing hard, guilt flashing across her face. General Briggs turned back to Ethan, her voice gentler now. Your grandfather was a hero, Ethan. One of the finest soldiers I have ever known. Ethan's throat tightened. His vision blurred slightly as his emotions swirled between pride, grief, and overwhelming humility. I didn't know, he whispered, barely able to speak. You do now, she replied softly, and you wear his memory with honor. Ethan's trembling fingers reached up to touch the patch once more. This time, it didn't feel like a worn piece of fabric. It felt like a badge of honor. The entire gym sat frozen, waiting, as if still absorbing the gravity of what had just been revealed. The boy who had walked into the assembly wearing what some called a hobo jacket now stood at the center of a story no one could have imagined, and the general who had once been pulled from the flames stood before him, honoring not only his grandfather, but him. The gymnasium remained suspended in absolute silence. Every breath, every heartbeat seemed amplified as General Briggs stood face to face with Ethan. The boy's chest rose and fell, his hands trembling as he clutched the edge of the old military jacket. The weight of his grandfather's legacy now rested fully on his shoulders. General Briggs took a single step back. The faintest trace of emotion flickered in her eyes. Respect, pride, and something deeply personal. Then, slowly and with perfect precision, she raised her right hand to her brow. The salute, sharp, crisp, and flawless. Gasps rippled through the gym. No one had expected this. A 4-star general rendering honors to a 16-year-old boy. For a long second, no one moved. Even the sound of distant traffic outside seemed to vanish. Then, almost instinctively, the veterans seated in the front row began to rise. Their uniforms aged, their hair silvered, but their movement steady as they brought their hands to their brows in synchronized salute. One after another, they stood, dozens of former soldiers who had fought their own wars, now standing tall for the young man before them. The sound of scraping chairs filled the gym as teachers followed. Principal Donovan, his throat tight, stood straight, his hand over his heart, unable to suppress the lump forming there. The students, though uncertain at first, slowly rose as well. The gym transformed into a wave of standing bodies, rising like a tide around Ethan. The air was thick with reverence, admiration, and awe. Mason lowered his phone, his smug grin long gone. His hand hung limply at his side as his eyes darted around, searching for something to anchor him. But there was nothing. Caleb stood frozen beside him, his mouth slightly agape, his bravado evaporated into the charged air. Brianna pressed a hand to her chest, her eyes glassy with emotion. She blinked rapidly, swallowing hard as the reality of what unfolded overwhelmed her. Ethan stood paralyzed. His heart pounded so violently it felt like it might burst. The jacket that had once made him feel invisible now burned like a beacon beneath the bright gym lights. General Briggs held her salute, her arm steady, waiting. A surge of something unfamiliar coursed through Ethan's body. Pride, strength, and a sense of belonging he'd never known. His trembling hand slowly rose, unsteady at first, but gaining firmness as it reached his brow. He returned the salute. For a brief moment, it felt like time itself paused. Two figures, decades apart in experience, connected by a single thread of legacy. The room exploded. Applause erupted like a crashing wave against the gym walls. It started with the veterans, their clapping powerful and steady, then the teachers, and finally the students, who cheered and hollered with genuine excitement. The once quiet gymnasium thundered with the collective energy of hundreds of voices honoring not only General Briggs, but Ethan and through him his grandfather. The ovation grew louder, echoing from wall to wall, as if the very building itself was joining the celebration. Ethan lowered his hand, blinking back tears as the roar of applause washed over him. His legs felt weak, but his heart swelled with a newfound confidence he had never felt before. He stood tall, no longer trying to hide or shrink away. The boy who had once eaten lunch alone, who had walked quietly through the halls trying to avoid notice, now stood at the very center of everyone's attention, not as a target of ridicule, but as a young man carrying a hero's legacy. Mason and Caleb shrank in their seats, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Their plan had disintegrated before them, replaced by a truth far more powerful than their petty mockery. The phones they once wielded like weapons now hung useless in their hands. Brianna wiped a tear from the corner of her eye, her breath catching in her throat. She had seen Ethan struggle for so long, but never understood the weight he had been carrying. Now, watching him stand under the applause of an entire school, her chest ached with both guilt and admiration. General Briggs lowered her salute and nodded once at Ethan, her voice low enough that only he could hear. Wear it with pride, young man. You've earned that right. Ethan swallowed hard and nodded back. Thank you, ma'am. Principal Donovan finally found his voice and stepped forward to the microphone, his own face flushed with emotion. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice cracking slightly before steadying. Let us remember that behind every uniform, every name, and every patch, there are stories that deserve our deepest respect. Today, we honor not only General Briggs, but Staff Sergeant Henry Monroe and his grandson Ethan, who carries his legacy with grace and humility. The applause roared again, even louder than before. The school band, still seated on the side of the gym, struck up a rendition of the national anthem. Students sang louder than usual, their voices unified in the spirit of the moment. The veterans sang too, their voices warm but proud. Ethan stood tall through it all, his breathing steady, his mind racing but clear. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't feel small. He didn't feel ashamed. He felt seen. As the anthem drew to a close and the applause slowly faded, General Briggs turned to rejoin the stage, leaving Ethan standing in the center of the floor, surrounded by classmates who now looked at him with new eyes. The bullies who once snickered behind his back sat quietly, invisible themselves. In that single moment, everything had changed. The echoes of the assembly still seemed to linger in the hallways long after the last chair had been folded away and the flags carefully stored. But for Ethan Monroe, everything felt different now, brighter, lighter, as though a heavy weight had been lifted from his shoulders. As he stepped out of the gym, the buzz of murmured voices followed him. Groups of students huddled together, whispering not with mockery but with genuine curiosity. Eyes that once slid past him now followed him with interest, some even with admiration. "Hey, Ethan!" A voice called from behind. He turned to see a small group approaching, classmates who had barely acknowledged him before. At the front was Brianna. She moved carefully, her expression sincere and nervous. "Hey!" she said softly, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. "Can I talk to you for a sec?" Ethan nodded, still a little unsure of how to handle this new attention. She took a breath. I want to say I'm sorry for not speaking up, for not stopping Mason and Caleb when I should have. I knew what they were doing was wrong, but I didn't have the guts to say anything." Her voice trembled slightly as she searched his face for a response. Ethan studied her for a moment. The old Ethan might have shrugged or muttered something awkward, retreating into himself. But standing here now, after what he had experienced, he found his voice steady. "Thank you for saying that," he replied gently. "It means a lot." Relief washed over her face. "You're really brave, you know. And your grandfather, he sounds like he was amazing." Ethan smiled, his fingers unconsciously brushing the Recon Lightning patch on his shoulder. "He was—" Brianna smiled back before stepping aside, allowing others to approach. One by one, students came forward, some simply offering a quiet nod of respect, others asking questions about his grandfather's story. They weren't mocking anymore. They were curious, respectful. Then, surprisingly, Mason appeared at the edge of the group. His usual smugness was absent. His hands were stuffed awkwardly in his pockets as he approached, eyes cast downward. "Hey, Mason mumbled, his voice low and uneasy. "I was a jerk. We were jerks. I guess I didn't know the story behind it." Ethan looked at him, sensing the discomfort radiating off Mason like heat. For a brief second, he debated how to respond. But instead of bitterness, he found something else. Peace. "Yeah," Ethan said calmly. "You didn't." Mason nodded once, awkwardly shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Well, anyway, sorry, man." Without waiting for a reply, Mason turned and shuffled off, leaving Ethan standing a little taller. As the crowd thinned, Laura appeared beside him, her eyes glistening with pride. "You did great, sweetheart," she whispered, squeezing his shoulder. Before he could reply, General Briggs approached, her military uniform still perfectly pressed, her expression warm but composed. She gestured for them to join her in a quiet corner of the hallway, away from the remaining students and teachers. "I wanted to speak with you both before I head back to Washington," General Briggs said. "There's so much more about Henry that I'd like to share." Laura smiled gratefully. "We'd love that." The general's face softened as she looked at Ethan. "Your grandfather was more than a hero in battle. He was a mentor, a protector, and a man who carried the burdens of war with dignity and grace. After that night in Dactu, he became someone we all looked up to. Even after I became an officer, I carried his lessons with me." Ethan listened, his chest swelling with pride. For so long, he had only known his grandfather through fading photographs and a few guarded stories. Now, each word from General Briggs painted a fuller, richer picture of the man behind the uniform. He rarely spoke of Vietnam after he came home. Laura admitted softly. He always said some memories were too heavy to share. General Briggs nodded knowingly. That's true for many of us. But his action spoke louder than any story ever could. "And now you're part of that legacy, Ethan." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. "Thank you, General, for everything." General Briggs offered one final nod, her eyes shining with unspoken emotion. "Wear that jacket with pride. You honor him every time you do." With that, she extended her hand. Ethan shook it firmly, feeling the strength in her grip, but also the warmth behind it. Laura shook her hand as well, her eyes misting over once more. After the general departed, mother and son stood together for a moment, both quietly absorbing everything that had happened. "You ready to go home?" Laura finally asked. Ethan smiled. "Yeah." Days later, the morning sun broke through scattered clouds as Ethan made his way toward school. The chill in the autumn air bit his cheeks, but he hardly noticed. His grandfather's jacket rested proudly on his shoulders, the faded green fabric and frayed edges now symbols of honor rather than shame. As he walked through the school gates, students who once ignored him now nodded in greeting. Some smiled, others simply stepped aside respectfully. He returned their glances with quiet confidence. In the distance, Brianna waved and hurried to catch up, falling into step beside him. "Morning," she said brightly. "Morning," Ethan replied, his voice calm and self-assured. As they walked together, Mason and Caleb stood further down the hallway, heads low, making no effort to approach. Ethan didn't care. For the first time, he wasn't hiding. Each step he took felt lighter, stronger. The jacket didn't weigh him down anymore. It lifted him. He belonged not only to his own story, but to something larger, woven from sacrifice, bravery, and love. Sometimes the threads of the past carry the weight of unsung heroes. Never judged by appearances, behind every worn patch may lie a story worth saluting. And as Ethan walked the halls that once felt so lonely, his head held high, the story of Henry Monroe lived on with pride. What was your favorite moment in Ethan's journey? Let us know in the comments. Your thoughts mean a lot. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to share it with someone who needs a little inspiration today.